All right, back at it in Kinesiology 230. This is chapter 19, and this is presentation number 3. We're talking about exercise concerns of clients who are overweight or obese. And the biggies you have are listed here: heat intolerance, movement restriction, weight bearing stress, posture problems, low back pain, balance concerns, uh, hyperpenia and dyspnea, types of shortness of breath. And we know that individuals who are overweight and obese, that can be, we calculate out BMI. And we're talking about people who are in the 25 to 29.9 or 30 and above BMI range. And these are people who are carrying around a sizable amount of extra weight and the same bone structure as everybody else. So you can just imagine, like I mentioned before, 180 pounds. If I weigh 360 pounds, that would be like taking another me and putting it on my back, and I have to walk around with me all day long. It's just a ton of work to carry that extra weight around. And we know that one of the byproducts of work, right, and what we do is heat, is giving off heat. Now, what happens is, and the book goes into this a little bit here, that the excess adipose tissue creates an insulating layer. We know the person is working harder, so they're creating more heat, and the greater amount of tissue that the body has needs to be serviced by the circulatory system, and it's tough to thermoregulate at that point. So as a trainer to a client who is obese, perhaps there may be times where you have to take that client through lower intensity workouts. Perhaps you have to train them indoors in an air-conditioned environment. There might even be times where you have to go and work in a pool, and they might feel uncomfortable about that, but it might be of benefit for them to have them doing some aqua aerobics or jogging in the pool for several reasons, one of which will be cooler for them, and the other is it'll be much easier on their joints. So the the movement restriction that they have here is depending upon the amount of adipose tissue. Um, Different movement patterns might be limited. For example, if they have android type obesity, which is a good amount of obesity around the midsection, the possibility of that person bending over and touching their toes might be limited because of the adipose tissue. So they might not be able to even get into a piece of exercise equipment, which, in some regard is a little demeaning for the person. So you as a trainer have to be able to recognize that your client might not effectively fit on the leg extension machine, and to a certain regard, does the leg extension machine even make sense? And because of the excess weight that they're carrying around, could they theoretically get onto, say, a leg curl machine laying face down, or a supine bench press, and be able to get up off of the bench? They may not be able to do that because of the adipose tissue and the extra weight they're carrying around. So you have to be cognizant of that and be able to have some interventions built into the process and some exercise selection that accommodates maybe some of those limitations. And, you may go in with the greatest of intentions, say we're going to bench press, but if your client can't get on and off a bench press, you're going to have to find a different exercise to get the same results. So you're going to have to come up with some adaptations. That is for sure. So high BMI people, when we get like to the 30 and above, we're in 30 and above, we're in obese. And then when you get to like big body people, when you're talking plus 40 and they're 400 pounds, there's a sizable amount of stress that's being placed on the joints. And just moving around for them is a challenge. And you see some orthopedic adaptations where perhaps they walk and the adipose tissue in the thighs cause them to walk on the outside edges of their shoes, and they end up being supinated, or they circumduct the legs as opposed to walking linearly like most of us do. But what ends up happening is, because of the extra weight, they can't really do higher impact type movement patterns. And so as a trainer, you need to introduce in perhaps some lower impact activities. Could be cycling within reason, if they can actually get on a bike or not. Swimming makes sense. Aqua aerobic makes sense. Walking in the water makes sense. And I would even say shallow water jogging would make sense. Would I have that person running? No. Would I have them actually trying to, jog on a treadmill? No. So it has to make sense for the person, and the adaptations have to match the person that's in front of you. Um, the 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 idea here is the body itself, when a person is walking, will at any given time have one foot on the ground and the other foot can be in transition where both feet are on the ground or it's passing through and it's being picked up to be put down again. In running, there's a flight phase. In jogging, there's a bit of a flight phase. And so that could have very negative compressive effects on the body given the excess amount of weight. Now, I'm not saying wrap your people in bubble wrap because their bodies are accustomed to moving around with 400 pounds on it and you'll be able to push your people along. But you might get away from doing compressive type of activities or anything that causes high stress on the joints on the front end until they start losing some weight. You can push them along, don't get me wrong, but it's just a matter of choosing how you're going to push them along. Posture and low back pain, very common for obese and overweight individuals to have low back discomfort. It's as much from how the weight is distributed and being carried by the person. And what's interesting is the weight is lost, the discomfort is reduced, and they can start to bring in exercise for the midsection, which is fine. But I'll say this, when you start working with people and they start losing weight, they're changing their somatotype, right? They're losing this body weight. And in some regards, you may have to work with them to help re-educate their bodies as to where they are in space. But also, on the orthopedic side, because they've spent so much time in lower doses, perhaps because of a large amount of adipose tissue in the stomach area, and that translates to a shift in the pelvis, which translates to a shift in the femur, which translates to how their foot strike hits the ground in terms of heel first and being toed out. You may have to actually work with your clients to re-educate them how to actually move correctly when they lose weight. Absolutely, this happens. So with this, I would kind of take a moment just to read through this and make sure you're acquainted with this yellow over here to the right. I'm going to move on to the next. With balance, we're talking about a person's body mass, or another way to say it is how their body mass is distributed in terms of their center of mass. Front and back, side to side, top and bottom. If we draw and intersect those lines in between the human form, that would be your center of mass, right? And where that center of mass is over the base, that being the feet, matters. And when you're working with a client who's obese, movement is going to be part of the process, but the concept is you need to have some re-education of balance and coordination as they lose weight. Also, because people who are obese don't really get on and off of the floor and they don't really transition for fear of not being able to get back up off of the floor, you may have to work with them in a coached environment in getting on the floor and off of the floor, on equipment and off of equipment. And there's a bit of a learning curve that you have to go through with your client. But it needs to be taught in a way that's on a progressive basis where you're there to observe, correct, and spot the client and make sure they're remaining in good balance and don't fall and injure themselves. Because of the excess body weight, they're going to have increased respiratory rate. They might also have a labored or difficulty. They might have labored or difficulty breathing. That's hyperpnea and also dyspnea. And exercise itself is going to be challenging for your clients anyways, and they might experience a little bit of an anxiety response to working out, especially if they were tying the whole reason why they gained a bunch of weight in the first place as a way to protect themselves. They might view exercise as a way of them losing their armor. It sounds silly, but that's how I had it described to me at one point. So with these, during an exercise session, you know people are going to become short of breath, but you have this condition where you have this visceral fat, and the visceral fat deposits can limit the actual breathing mechanics. So you kind of have to presume that the person's going to have some low functional capacity, and to a certain degree, you may have to kind of guide them along and urge them along, and don't and urge them along, and maybe don't push them past an RPE of a certain level but use that RPE as a way for your client to articulate how they're feeling on a regular basis. It's complicated 100%. There's a lot that goes on to working with this population. And in some regards, you're dealing with people who, they need to have a little bit of control over the process to minimize some of the anxiety that brought them there in the first place. So you have to have that constant communication with them back and forth regarding how they're feeling and what their RPE is. But eventually they get to the point where they're so familiar with working out that it's a non-issue and you can shove them right along. All right, I'm moving on to the next presentation.